Reliability Organization. I joined MRO, or Midwest Reliability Organization, about 16 years ago. And for the past 6 years, I've had the distinct privilege of serving as president and CEO. While I am a lawyer by training, I am a compliance professional by choice, and really a lifelong student of life. And the benefit, or one of the benefits of being in this industry, is that there is a never-ending body of information to learn. And one of the things and the objectives of today is to share some of that knowledge and wisdom from our panelists who are joining us. But I wanted to provide a little bit of background about our structure. So MRO is one of 6 regional entities in North America operating under delegated authority from the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC. So NERC and the regions collectively we refer to ourselves as the ERO Enterprise. And while we are individual organizations with slightly different roles and responsibilities, we operate under a shared vision of a highly reliable and secure North American bulk power system. We also share a mission that's focused on identification, prioritization, and mitigation of risks to reliability and security of the power grid. And I mentioned that we operate under a delegation agreement, and some of those delegated responsibilities include assessments of performance and analysis of events on the system, as well as compliance monitoring and enforcement of NERC reliability standards. And foundational to this work is registration of owners, operators, and users of the bulk power system. So registration occurs based on the functions an entity or organization performs. For instance, a generator owner, a generator operator, a transmission owner, a transmission operator, to name just a few. And then once an entity is registered, they are then subject to mandatory compliance with the applicable NERC reliability standards. So NERC reliability standards address various operating and planning activities, as well as cyber and physical security. And each standard includes an identification of the applicable registered functions. So you're registered for functions, you are then required to comply with the applicable standards. And you'll hear more about the risks identified with the integration of inverter-based resources, or IBRs, and the registration and standards efforts associated with the IBR initiative from our panelists today. Now, before I introduce our panelists, there is one order of housekeeping. Please share any questions you might have in the chat feature. We'll make efforts to address those questions, but in the event that we aren't able to address questions, given the time we have today and the information and knowledge that's planned to be shared, I would direct you to the NERC website, where information on the IBR initiative is compiled in one place and regularly updated. So you'll hear more about the resources available on that site in just a few moments. Additionally, I would invite you to reach out to your regional entity contacts. We would love to provide you the answers you seek and to share any resources that are available. So with that, I'll now introduce our panelists. First up is Howard Google. So Howard is the Vice President of Regulatory Oversight at NERC. In that role, he's responsible for directing programs and processes to monitor, review, and evaluate program effectiveness of NERC's risk-based compliance monitoring and enforcement. In 2022, Howard was appointed to the Department of Energy's Electric Advisory Committee by the Secretary of Energy. He also serves on the North American Energy Standards Board. Mr. Google has more than 34 years of experience in the electric utility industry. He'll also be joined by Johnny Guest. Johnny's the Manager of Engineering and System Performance at Reliability First, one of our sister organizations, sister regions. In that role, Johnny strives to create a culture of continuous reliability improvement with entities through outreach in the Assist Visit program and evaluation of entities' internal controls and management practices. Johnny worked for 13 years at First Energy in Akron, Ohio, in transmission planning, operations, and project development. At First Energy, Johnny focused his efforts to reinforce the bulk power system, including compliance with NERC reliability standards and administering over $5 billion in transmission projects. Also joining us today is Mark Tiemeyer. Mark joined the Midwest Reliability Organization in July 2022 as the Principal Technical Advisor. In that role, Mark leads MRO's efforts to identify and prioritize regional risks to the bulk power system. Mark has 17 years of experience in industry, mainly in engineering and supervisory roles within transmission system operations. And finally, Ted Franks. So Ted is the Director of Reliability Assurance at CERC Reliability Corporation. And Ted has over 20 years of electric utility experience. And prior to joining CERC, Ted worked for PJM in system operations, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in the Office of Electric Reliability, as well as some time at the North American Transmission Forum. I look forward to hearing from and learning from these experts today. Howard, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks so much for the introduction, and thank you all for attending this webinar. Just want to take a little bit of time today to talk about our inverter-based resource strategy that we're doing, and kind of maybe answer any questions that you might have about what NERC and the regions are doing in this space. So next slide. This is our agenda. You'll see as we go through the slides today that I'll be covering what our IBR strategy is, what are some reliability trends that we've seen as we've been looking through inverter-based resources as they relate to events on the transmission system. Also our plan to address a few FERC orders that we received in this area, and then show you the timeline for completion for all of those things. Next slide. Our website, for those of you that aren't aware, is a very great source of information for all things reliability concerned, especially as it relates to the bulk power system. And one of the things that we post on there are reports for all of our events that occur on the system. So as things occur in various interconnections across North America, we will do an investigation into it and look to see, okay, what maybe was the root cause of what happened there? What were some things that contributed to impacts to reliability? And then what are some of the lessons that we can learn from that? Over the last 6+ years, we've seen an increasing number of events that have involved inverter-based resources. And many of those are involving resources that are connected at lower voltages than what we had traditionally looked at for bulk electric system. And they are connected at lower megawatt thresholds, so smaller units, if you will, connected together, and then also at smaller levels. But what we are seeing is that they have common mode reactions to events. So whether it's faults that occur on the system or changes that occur due to load problems or generation problems, we will see multiple inverter-based resources have the same reaction on the system. Based on that, we also have been talking with the folks that own these resources and that install these resources to see whether or not they're looking at performance validation studies. So are they ensuring that these generators are performing the way that they had spec'd them originally? And we are finding that at least prior to most of these events, that there's not any kind of validation activity that's occurring there. This has kind of led to the combination of all these reports, us seeing that IBRs have the potential to have a material impact on the bulk electric system and the bulk power system. And it's not limited to the threshold that we have typically used for registering generation. Therefore, we have begun an effort to look at what additional inverter-based resources should be required to be subject to mandatory standards because of their impact to reliability. So that would be kind of a twofold thing: one, to register with us, and then two, to be compliant with our reliability standards. Next slide. So that's why we're here today. The problem statement is we've done an analysis both at NERC and also at the regions that have determined that the integration of these inverter-based resources onto the bulk power system do have material impacts on reliability, and they must be mitigated or managed. And so our strategy is we have two initiatives that are looking at mitigating the risk. At the heart of those is revising our rules of procedure to basically lower the threshold for inverter-based resources for them to be registered to be compliant with our standards, and then also revising and developing our reliability standards that would specifically be applicable to inverter-based resources. Next slide. This started back in 2021 timeframe, 2020, 2021 timeframe, when we at NERC and also at various regions that were beginning to see a significant increase in inverter-based resources, begin to see these trends on event reports that were occurring. Um, what we had noticed was almost 20%, 16% of bulk power system connected IBRs were not subject to our mandatory and enforceable reliability standards, but were showing to be impactful. Just to kind of give you a perspective, at this point, if you look at synchronous generators or traditional generators, so hydro, gas, coal, nuclear, the things that have typically been connected to our system in the past synchronously, about 97% of those that are connected to the bulk power system are registered and are compliant with our reliability standards, or are held to be compliant with our reliability standards. That relates to about 84% of bulk power system connected IBRs. So that's 16% less that's there. So that shows you that there's a bit of a gap between how many of traditional generations are registered and how many are not. In conjunction with that analysis and kind of in help to support of that, FERC issued a directive in 2022 to direct us to develop a work plan to identify and register unregistered owners and operators of inverter-based resources that have a material impact on the reliable operation of the power system. And I'll mention a little bit later what our work plan is on that, but we did file and it was approved by FERC. And then last year in October, FERC issued Order 901 that directed us to develop some either new or modify some of our existing reliability standards to address gaps in specific areas: data sharing, model validation, planning and operational studies, and then also performance requirements. And later on in this presentation, you'll see what our work plan is for that too. Next slide. We have a multi-dimensional, if you will, approach to looking at inverter-based resources, and it doesn't just involve registration of resources and mandatory and enforceable standards, but we have many tools and many things that we're looking at. One area is risk analysis. As I mentioned before, we do a lot of events analysis and look to see how they're impactful on the system, but we also issue alerts and lessons learned in those areas. We've also had conversations with transmission owners and operators and also with FERC about some of the things that could be done in the interconnection process that could help in this area. So the improvements to small and large generator interconnection agreements and enhancing some of the requirements that are in there. And then we've been actively participating in several IEEE standard developments that involve the connection of inverter-based resources to high and medium voltage situations, and then also aggregations for those for the power output from that. But next slide, what I'd like to concentrate on today is those last two columns that we have there. And today is some education that we'll be seeing. So this is one of the webinars or workshops that we're providing to talk about this. We have technical committees across North America that are developing reliability guidelines and also actively engaged in outreach and engagement. And then finally, the last column there is talking about our regulatory enhancements that we're doing. So we do have several standards projects that are in process right now for modifying or developing reliability standards. We're looking at the definition of the bulk electric system. At this point, don't anticipate any changes of that, but that certainly is something that we would continue to evaluate. And then we are looking also at what are some specific requirements that would be applicable to inverter-based resources. And then finally, that all rolls into our risk-based compliance. We look at compliance with the standards through a risk lens, and what things are most impactful to the system from a reliability standpoint. Those are the things that we would be concentrating on. Next slide. So I've got a couple of slides here to kind of outline the scope of what we're looking at. This is the resource mix as we saw it in 2012 and 2022. So generation profile across North America and how that was blended with nuclear, coal, gas, hydro, and then solar and wind at the time, and then also, any other types of PV that would be there for maybe batteries. And as you can see, we've seen a decrease in coal and oil. No surprise. Most of you know that there have been many retirements that have occurred, but we're seeing an increase, if you will, on solar PV and also in the wind area. So you can see the top two bars there and how they've changed. So that's been the offset between those two. But overall, if you look at the capacity, we've actually seen a 4% decrease in overall generation capacity over that time frame. So we've retired more traditional generation and we put new generation online. So why is that a concern? Well, it wouldn't be a concern if your load level was flat or if you had a lot of extra capacity on the system. But let me show you the next area over there, which is that picture of North America. What are our concerns in 2025? Well, as you can see, we have many concerns, both extreme and elevated, across all of North America, where we think that there may be situations where there's not sufficient energy to cover load at certain times of the year. And so we've highlighted that and are basically shedding the light on the fact that we need some more capacity in various areas and that we need some additional transmission. You'll see that a little bit later too, but transmission capability to get power from areas that have excess capacity to areas that don't. That the bottom slide there, or the bottom chart, shows the difference in load between 2012 and 2022. So as you can see, although generation capacity has decreased, we've seen a 3% increase over that time in load. Some might say, well, that doesn't seem to be a lot. And I would say that's, at least on the surface, you're right. It probably doesn't look like a lot. But there's a couple of things that could be masking this. One of them is the amount of generation that's behind the load that would be offsetting that meter and that metered load. And then the second concern would be, while that may show our historical projections, we do know that there is, in certain parts of the country, a quick transition from fossil-based transportation and fossil-based residential heating to electric areas. And we're seeing an increase in load and projections of increase in load that are fairly massive over the next 10 years. Next slide. The other thing that you can consider here is, well, how do these new resources react to changes in environment? You can kind of think of wind and sunlight as fuel, just like gas or water, whatever is needed to power that generation. And there are times when we see a significant decrease in either sunlight that's available or wind that would be available for windmills. That the top part there is a significant finding. June of last year, 2023, there were situations that occurred across a pretty wide swath, all the way from Texas all the way up into MISO and SPP, where there's 60 gigawatts, so 60,000 megawatts of installed wind capacity. And at particular times of day, we only had 300 megawatts of generation during that time because there was just no wind available, no fuel available, if you will, for those generators. So while it looks like you've got lots of capacity there, you've got 60,000 megawatts of generation, you really could only get an output of about 300 during that time. The other thing that we're seeing, and that's in the bottom chart there, is that transmission is becoming more and more of a concern. So there were times, and this is during one of the winter storms that occurred out in the east a couple of years ago. There were times when we had excess capacity in one part of the system, PJM, and there was generation deficit outside of that, either in the MISO area or down in the southern areas of our country, where that generation could not get out because of transmission limitations. So one of the things that we are looking at NERC, and we've also been directed to do by Congress, is to look at interregional transfer capability. So to look at what kind of transmission needs to be put in place so that generation can be transferred across the system when there are times that you have excess in one area and you have a need for it in another. Next slide. This, I admit right up front, you heard a little bit of my background, but I am an electrical engineer, and there are times when I just need a picture to help me understand what a trade-off is. We talked about the wind situation and the fact that we had a deficit of capacity during that time. I sat down one day and I was like, I know that there's something here, but I just can't get it. So did a little mental exercise to say, okay, if I retire 100 megawatts of conventional baseload generation, that means it's generation that is dispatched around the clock, 24 hours. How do I replace that with a combination of solar and batteries? Because I mean, there's times the sun isn't shining, so you need batteries or something as a backup for that. And so I said, okay, what are my assumptions here? Well, I'm going to assume that I get 8 hours of sunlight a day. And that's an average number. There will be times in the summer where you might have more. There'll be times in the winter where you might have less. There'll be times, during the off-peak times where maybe you have cloud cover or such. But let's just pick a number on average of 8 hours. So what can I do? Well, if I install 100 megawatts, so exact trade-off of what I retired, if I install 100 megawatts of solar, I can get output during 8 hours of that day because that's when the sun is shining. And that gives me 800 megawatt hours of energy. However, there's another 16 hours where that sun's not shining that I need to cover the demand or the load to keep the lights on during that time. So what can I do? Well, I'll install batteries. Batteries aren't generators. I refer to them as time shifting devices. So I could take energy when it's readily available and store it and then use it at times when that energy is not available. So what do I do? Well, if I assume the current technology, which most battery installations at this point are using, it's lithium ion. It has about a 4-hour draw on it. So it has the ability to produce energy for 4 hours. I can install 400 megawatts of storage, 400 megawatts of batteries for a 4-hour discharge, and that would give me 1,600 megawatt hours. So I could dispatch 200 megawatts of those batteries for 4 hours and then do another 200 megawatts for 4 hours to get me through. So what does that mean? Well, then I've got to charge those batteries during the time when the sun is shining. So I need 200 megawatts of solar to charge those batteries during the 8 hours. So if I want to do a 1-for-1 replacement of 100 megawatts that was baseload that ran around the clock with a combination of solar and batteries with the assumptions that I'm using here, then I need 300 megawatts of solar and 400 megawatts of batteries to be installed to replace that 100 megawatts. Is that good? Is it bad? No, it's just a reality. I mean, that's how you do the trade-off there. Are there some advantages that you can get with inverter-based resources? Yes, because they have electronic controls, they can respond much faster to events that occur on the system if they're designed that way. They also have the ability to provide some essential reliability services, again, if they're designed that way. So there are, many good things that can come from reliability on that, but you need to make sure that you take care of that in the design phase. We have those standards and we have those requirements that we developed for synchronous generators all along. At this point, we need to also develop and enforce those standards for inverter-based resources going forward too, so that we can operate the system reliably and we can keep the lights on for the folks around the clock. Next slide. So this talks a little bit about our work plan that we filed with FERC. This is specifically for 901 and its response to developing standards. So we have a time frame that we'll be doing for that. We filed it in January of this year. We'll be revising reliability standards that look at performance requirements and expect to have those completed by November of this year. Next year, we're going to have data sharing and model validation requirements. And we expect to have those done in November of next year, 2025. And then finally, looking at operational and planning studies that would be required, and we see those in 2026. Um, we know that communication is a key on this, and that we're going to need to make sure that we communicate early and often on everything that we're doing in this area. So we've worked with our communications department, some great professionals that we've got both in the regions and also at NERC that have developed this really great quarterly update that we send out. We sent out our first one in February of this year, but it provides a nice access with links for everything that's related to inverter-based resources, and also shows what was covered over the last quarter and what we expect to cover over the next quarter or two. So it provides a lot of information that's very helpful for folks. Next slide. As far as our registration effort, in March of this year, we filed our proposed revisions with FERC. In that, we're proposing to change our definition of generator owner and generator operator to include inverter-based resources. And those would be those that have an aggregated nameplate capacity greater than or equal to 20 megawatts or MVA, and they're connected at a voltage greater than or equal to 60 kV. So if you want to think about typically on the system, anything 69 kV and above that's connected at a common point that has a capacity greater than 20. If we do this, and we kind of base this on some data that's been collected by the Department of Energy, this would put us somewhere around the same thing that we have for synchronous generators. About 97% of impactful inverter-based resources would become subject to reliability standards and make them kind of on that same footing that we have for synchronous generators. As I mentioned before, though what we're talking about now doesn't change the definition of the bulk electric system as we have it defined, and it doesn't immediately impact reliability standards. We're just talking about who needs to be registered and how they in the future would be compatible with reliability standards. Next slide. These are the registration milestones that we have. So we have filed, you can see that phase one is complete. We have filed that with FERC and are waiting for approval on that. We are beginning our outreach and education. Part of what we're doing here is part of that. We're also working through the trades and working specifically through some of the trades that have inverter-based resources as a focus. Specifically, one of the groups is SIA. There's some others that we're doing some outreach with. At this point, FERC is reviewing our rules of procedure changes, and they're either going to approve those or direct further changes, but we do expect them to act within the next couple of months. At that point, we'll begin phase two, which will be that identification of the candidates for GO and GOP, and then doing our outreach, specifically a targeted outreach to them. And again, providing quarterly updates, webinars, and workshops on our website. And then finally, in 2025, all the way up through 2026, we would expect to complete our registration of those candidates, make them aware of the standards that are applicable to them, and help them understand, the reliability obligation that they have. You can see that meshes in very well with the standards development steps that I mentioned earlier about how different standards are going to be developed there too. Next slide. We have 3 right now active projects that deal with inverter-based resources, and this just kind of shows how they are communicating with each other. So we've got what we're calling a ride-through performance criteria standard. We're also looking at disturbance monitoring. So as disturbances occur in the system, what type of equipment needs to be out there to detect that, and what data needs to be stored for the analysis on it. And then how do we do a post-event analysis on events that occur there? So those 3 projects are in place right now. Standards are being developed in all 3 of those areas, or modified in all 3 of those. And then all of them involve some corrective action plans as a feedback for that. Next slide. I mentioned our quarterly communication. We also have a link on our website to the IBR initiative. So if you go to the NERC website, there's a banner at the very top of it. One of the words at the top says initiatives, and if you hover over that with your mouse, it'll do a drop down and you'll see inverter-based resources as one of the initiatives there. That will take you to this page, which gives you a quick reference guide for the registration and initiative. All kinds of links, all kinds of helpful information. We have FAQs posted there. We have reference guides. We have links to all of our events that have occurred that where you can go back and look at all of those things that will work there, and then also provide some educational materials there. So a great resource. I can't emphasize enough. If you have questions about what NERC's doing in inverter-based resource space, that's really the first place to go to, is to hop to that initiative page and find that information out. Next slide. The other way is the more face-to-face way. We also have contacts in every one of the regions that will be more than happy to answer any questions that you've got or direct you to resources either on each of the regional entities page or on NERC's page for what we're doing in inverter-based resource space. So all of that information is here. This presentation will be available afterwards, and would encourage you to reach out with any questions that you've got that maybe don't get answered today, that we could answer at a future time. And with that, I think the next slide shows that we are at a point for questions and answers. So I will turn that back over to you, Sarah.
Well, thank you, Howard. That was an excellent overview and summary of the project to date. And now I'm going to turn to Johnny. With the understanding that Howard began his presentation kind of highlighting a number of disturbance reports related to IBR performance, can you detail the primary causes of these disruptions and how they led the ERO Enterprise to prioritize this IBR initiative?
Sure. Yeah, actually, Howard's presentation provided a nice backdrop to this particular question, giving you the background information for this. Basically, the large demand and interconnection of IBRs to the grid, they're contributing to rapid grid transformation. When you combine these newer technologies with a fast rate of change, a risk can develop if these resources are not integrated to the grid properly. As Howard mentioned during his presentation, since 2016, NERC has developed 10 disturbance reports related to inverter-based performance during grid events. One of the main themes that materialized in these reports is an increased accuracy in system studies of IBRs. So what this means is that the models that are used to perform these studies need to accurately represent the behavior of IBRs. As an example, when a resource requests connection to the grid, it's very important to obtain the necessary field data to perform these detailed integration studies to ensure that these IBRs are going to operate as intended in the future. Another one of the themes identified in these disturbance reports is the development of protection settings that allow IBRs to sufficiently respond, recover, and stay connected to the grid during events. IBR disturbance reviews have identified protection system settings being used that actually reduces the ability of IBRs to remain connected to the grid during the disturbance, which causes those IBRs to actually be disconnected during the event. And again, as Howard mentioned in his presentation, based on the frequency and impact of these potential IBR performance issues, NERC has identified this risk as a priority within its risk framework. And this has led to multiple white papers, FERC orders, level 2 NERC alert, which basically is a survey out to industry, and multiple projects to modify NERC reliability standards. And this is around interconnection studies, modeling, protective relay performance, and planning and real-time operations. So thank you for the question.
Thanks. A lot of effort being undertaken to address this risk. So how might the proposed registration criteria changes enhance resilience of the power grid during the types of disturbances you outlined?
Well, again, Howard did some of the work for me here on this question, but as a reminder, the criteria includes registration for entities that own, maintain, and operate non-BES inverter-based generating resources that have an aggregate nameplate capacity of greater than 20 MVA and a common point of interconnection at a voltage greater than or equal to 60 kV. So it's expanding kind of the voltage level and lowering the megawatt threshold, the MVA threshold for these connections. And according to the NERC 2023 Long-Term Reliability Assessment, the LTRA, you can actually Google and just find this report. If you type in NERC 2023 Long-Term Reliability Assessment, there is significant growth in solar, wind, battery energy storage system. And this accounts for about 70% of the new generation in development for connecting to the bulk power system. As both BES and non-BES resources are added to the grid, the risk for IBR disturbances increases. So if the historical performance issues that we've experienced that are outlined in these disturbance reports are perpetuated into the future, grid events could expand into substantial loss of IBR resources. This in turn could lead to events that compromise the reliability of an entire interconnection, causing widespread outages.
And that's not something we want to see.
No.
I'm gonna turn to Mark now and focus on the impact of the registration initiative. So Mark, what challenges or opportunities are there for integrating large number of IBRs to the grid?
Yes, Sarah, thanks for the question. So just since the beginning of the electric grid, we have designed and operated the system around these synchronous resources that Howard talked about. I like to think of them as rotating machines. And these machines, they don't only provide energy, which is what is being used to serve customer load, but they also provide, again, what Howard referred to as kind of essential reliability services. And those are used to support the grid and make sure that it can remain reliable and stable. And when they think about inverter-based resources, that just brings a whole new flavor of electric generation to the grid. And it's one that's fundamentally different than those rotating machines, because they are based on basically a configured control within a power electronic interface. And I basically like to think of an inverter-based resources as it's a computer that produces energy. And so like any computer that you can think of, the inputs that you're putting into that are very important to determining what you're actually going to get out of it. I hate to say the garbage in, garbage out principle, but that's kind of what I'm equating this to. And realistically, the industry, since these are such a new resource for us, we're still grappling with the best inputs to set in these different configured controls. And as with any new technology, there is going to be a learning curve to deploying that. So again, I think we're still as an industry kind of at the initial stages of this curve. It explains kind of why you see some of the performance concerns that Johnny talked about. And really, inverter-based resources are kind of like a double-edged sword. They can respond extremely quickly to changing conditions, and they're also very highly controllable, right? Because you can configure exactly how you want them to respond. So this produces a great opportunity to fine-tune the response of these resources to get optimal behavior. However, just kind of going back to those rotating machines, this control on these inverter-based resources is so much faster than the response of a conventional machine. And that's not because conventional machines are slow. They are extremely fast as well. It's an order of magnitude higher. And that conventional generation, as we have the current mix, it's currently driving grid stability. And so now we have to think about how we're going to integrate these inverter-based resources into the mix, which is still dominant in conventional resources. And we need to have those settings, the inputs to those controllers, to coordinate with the physical behavior of the existing fleet. And we also then have to consider, as we're getting more and more inverter-based resources to the grid, that they also interplay with each other. So an IBR, down the street, if you will, from another one, can negatively interact with that other IBR, and so you have to really consider that as well. And with the pace and the speed at which these resources are connecting, it does put a lot of requirements on grid engineers to make sure, again, those inputs are set correctly.
So what can be done to support reliable operations as more IBRs are connected to the grid?
Yeah, so I like to think the gateway to the grid, if you will, for any generation that wants to connect, and that includes inverter-based resources, is the generation interconnection queue process when it comes to different providers of transmission. That could be large regional transmission organizations or individual utilities. And it's so important that those entities provide clear and consistent performance requirements when it comes to interconnection, so that the expectations are understood on exactly how they should be controlled. And so you look at regional transmission organizations like a MISO or a PJM, they're in the process of adopting certain performance standards specific to inverter-based resources into their interconnection guidelines. And the overall intent of that is to have a level playing field for those resources and require that performance supporting grid stability and reliability. And as we've already talked about quite a bit here, is NERC for its part is also modifying and creating new standard requirements that are specific to inverter-based resources. And the reason that's needing to be done, again, goes back to the fact that our grid has kind of stood itself up on these rotating machines, like these large synchronous machines in the past, if you want to call them that. And we have to adjust. We have to change the standards to recognize that this new type of resources is really coming into the field here, and we need to have the standards apply to those resources so that they can support reliability the same way that existing generation does.
So both Howard and Johnny explained a little bit about the revised registration criteria, but can you explain how that revised registration criteria will impact inverter-based resources with an aggregate nameplate capacity of 20 MVA or greater? And why was that capacity level chosen?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was already mentioned that in my mind, I see this as kind of lowering that bar when it comes to an entity that has to be subject to NERC reliability standards. So now, instead of requiring resources that are above the typical, 75 MVA rating, which is what would constitute them as a bulk electric resource or bulk energy system resource, now we have this new lower threshold, and that brings these entities into the fold now when it comes to having to have programs to comply with NERC reliability standards. They have to be aware of all the different activities that are going on at NERC when it comes to these projects that are out there that are going to create new requirements of those resources to perform. And then just getting in a little bit about, I guess, the why that level was chosen. And I think Howard, described this, but I'll reiterate it. Howard talked about, 84% of inverter-based resources are currently in the fold when it comes to NERC reliability standards today, compared to 97% of the existing, rotating machine base. So that 20 MVA threshold was kind of the point at which you bring that 84% of inverter-based resource up to that 97% level that we have for the existing fleet. So it was kind of the trade-off of let's bring up that participation level to be the same between an inverter-based resource and a conventional resource.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. So what resources are available to assist state regulators and energy officials in understanding and implementing these changes?
Yeah, and Howard did a good job kind of describing the quick reference guide on NERC's website. I'm not going to necessarily reiterate exactly how to get there, but that's a good jumping off point for anyone to go and wants to learn more about this initiative, wants to learn more about inverter-based resources. One of the links that I really like on that quick reference guide is a link to NERC's inverter-based resource strategy document. And that's a great companion if you want to get into a little bit more detail around why inverter-based resources are so important to the grid and why we need to take these efforts to mitigate the impacts and integrate them well into the system. I can say that there is so much information out there on NERC's website around this. and it's really an opportunity kind of to you can go into as deep a detail as you possibly want to, but you can also stay at that high level as well. We talked a little bit about event reports, and I think you can read, if you really want to get into the down and dirty on every single one of those events, that information is out there on NERC's website. And yeah, that's good.
If you have something else to share, please speak up.
No, it's good.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think there is a wide array of information available, and I think at all levels to help lawyers in the room as well as the technical experts that we have here on the panel joining us today. So we've learned a little bit about the risk and the registration initiative. Let's switch gears and learn a bit more about new and revised standards. And I'm going to turn to Ted for that. So Ted, can you share what efforts are underway at the ERO Enterprise to ensure that new or revised standards are expediently put into place so we don't interrupt the integration of IBRs onto the bulk power system? Oh, you're muted. There we go.
It helps to unmute. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so as Howard touched in his slides, in January this year, NERC submitted a 3-year plan to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So those standards will address IBR performance, data sharing, modeling, and operations and planning studies. As far as interrupting the integration of IBRs associated with any state generation portfolio mandates, I don't see either endeavor negatively impacting each other. Rather, it will enhance the integration of these IBRs as we go through this generation mix change. And to be clear, there are already standards in place to ensure the reliability and security of the bulk power system. The revision to these standards is to fine tune them to account for some of the differences between IBR and traditional generation.
So what do IBR owners and operators need to understand about these proposed changes?
Sure. So for the entities that are already registered as generator owners, they will understand the timelines, enforcement dates, applicability, et cetera. However, we will see an influx of generator owners that are new to the regulatory world and standards. And currently, amongst the ERO, multiple outreach efforts are being made to help them, these new generators, stand up and implement, strong compliance programs. And I do want to reach out to the audience here and ask a favor. So for the state regulators, if you happen to be in meetings with some of these generator owners, if the topic of NERC standards comes up in a conversation and you get a deer in the headlight look, please send them our way. Their success and our success will be greatly intertwined, as the generation mix continues to change.
So how might these changes improve grid stability during major disturbances?
Sure. So the intent of these changes is to reduce the possibility of systemic performance issues and prevent the widespread reduction of power. As the resource mix is changing, we are looking forward. We are looking for ways to ensure new types of resources are operated reliably and are equipped with and designed to provide similar reliability characteristics as traditional resources provide. At the end of the day, our mandate is to, ensure the stability, no cascading, and no uncontrolled separation from a single event. So the mission remains the same.
Well, thank you for that, Ted. Howard, we heard Mark talked a little bit about the resources that are available to state regulators, and Ted just gave us a hint or a favor to ask from those who might be in the room in that capacity. But Howard, can you talk to us about what impact these anticipated changes might have on state level energy policies and regulations? And should state regulators expect to see a cost associated with complying with these new criteria?
Absolutely. The impact is, I guess the thing to keep in mind, or what we would ask that you keep in mind is, as you're setting policy for each of your states, and as you're considering either transitions for residential use away from traditional fossil to more electrification, that you understand the ramifications of that and what that means for the entire electric ecosystem. As I pointed out before, at this point, we're retiring generation faster than we're putting it on. And there's going to be a point at which there's not going to be excess energy available there. And so we've got to all work together to ensure that we're getting adequate capacity and energy installed on the system to meet the needs of our customers and to keep those lights on at all time. Is there going to be a cost associated with this? I mean, there's going to be a cost for compliance with any type of regulation. That cost, though, will be rolled into that eventual rate that would be recovered from the generator for the energy that's produced. Do we expect it to be substantial? I don't expect it to be substantial, but I'm not going to sit here and say that it's not going to cost anything. But frankly, all existing generation has a cost for compliance, and that's rolled into the existing rates that are there for that energy too. So yeah, there will be somewhat of a cost for this, but it's small based on the reliability benefit that would be received from it.
Thank you. Thank you. So what guidance do you have for states around effectively integrating these anticipated changes into existing regulatory frameworks?
Two things. One, like I'll just emphasize what I mentioned earlier. Recognize the second and third order effects from any regulation that's put in at the state level and how it would impact anything that's at the federal level or certainly at the NERC level. And then the second one I would say is, we're concentrating on generation that is at a higher level than what you would see at the distribution level. What we would refer to as DERs, or distributed energy resources. At this point, that the policy for those is more controlled by each state. What I think I would ask for folks to do is look at the reports that we have out there and the way that existing generation, either behind the meter or at lower levels than what we're talking about, doing the registration here, how they're also having an impact upon reliability. And maybe it can help frame some of the policies that you put in place for behind the meter generation, or how that generation is aggregated, or how it's incorporated onto the system. Use some of the information that we've been able to gather, some of the lessons that we've learned, to maybe help inform you and inform your staff about some of the engineering and operational technical issues that we've seen, and how just planning with that in mind can make a big impact at the end.
Well, thank you for that. I am again going to remind folks, if you have a question, to please insert that in the chat. So far, we haven't seen any questions from the audience, but I do have another question here for all our panelists. So if there's one thing you want folks to take away from what we've discussed today, what would that one thing be?
I can
I'll go first.
Oh, go ahead.
So the one thing is education is key. Understanding, from my perspective, understanding how these resources interact with each other, the benefits that can come from them, and how important it is to plan with the outcome in mind is kind of key. So learning as much as you can about these resources, how they're going to be interconnected and integrated into each one of your states, and then how your state policy can help influence the overall reliability that end use customer is going to see is going to be important.
Well, thank you for that, Howard. Johnny, did you have something to share?
I was excited to just jump in there, and I interrupted Howard. So I think the key takeaway from me is Howard had a really good slide where he had the scales and the balance between conventional resources and solar plus battery storage. And I think my takeaway is diversity. So when you're looking at a resource plan for your particular state, you have to take in mind solar alone might not be enough. You want to look at diversifying your resource portfolio as much as you can, because some of those resources are susceptible to certain types of events that cause outages, cold weather events, grid disturbances, so on and so forth. So you want to build a resilient plan where you can have that energy when you need it, daytime or nighttime, and when you have an extreme event on the grid. So just keep that in mind, that you want to have a diverse kind of resource portfolio so your state remains resilient during, extreme type events or major disturbances. And just one other thing, there's a lot of resources available for states to learn about this aside from what we're presenting here, but I would encourage states to interact with their utilities and ensure that they're using common industry standards. They're looking at the NERC materials. They're looking at the IEEE standards like 1547 and P2800 that all surround IBR performance. And make sure they're aware of that and trying to incorporate that into their connection processes. I think that would be helpful as well.
Well, thank you for that, Johnny. I too found that visual really impactful with the scales. Even the non-engineers in the room could really have some solid takeaways from that image and the explanation that Howard shared. Ted, did you have something to share?
Well, as far as the takeaway, I think I already gave mine when they're talking to these generator owners. If their paths do cross, just make sure that they are aware of the compliance obligations that do go, with coming onto the system. Not asking the states or anyone to be experts, just send them our way if they have not heard of the FERC-NERC region paradigm.
Well, very good. Mark, did you have anything you wanted to share as a takeaway from today's conversation?
Yeah, I'll just kind of reiterate, one of my main points, which is really, you recognizing that inverter-based resources and the conventional rotating machines do behave differently. But I didn't probably cover this as clearly, but they both can support grid reliability. It's not to say these new inverter-based resources are bad, right? They're just different. And just with this transition, there's this, with great challenge comes great opportunity, and we have that opportunity today to really define the future path of how we're going to integrate these resources into the grid. And again, that determining factor is getting those right inputs. Getting the right inputs to the controls of these resources from the get-go at the interconnection stage. And then on top of that, I didn't mention this earlier. Once these resources are interconnected, it's constantly monitoring and constantly making sure the performance of them is adequate. And that's not NERC is absolutely in the ERO Enterprise is going to be doing that as well, but it's really important for the generator owners to be doing that and working with their interconnecting transmission operators, grid operators, that when the performance isn't good, to make adjustments and to work with them to get kind of grid friendly behaviors out there.
Well, thank you for that, Mark. Looks like we do have at least one online question. Flora, can you share that question? So it looks like the question is, at what point in project development does NERC registration usually take place, and what does the registration process entail? Are there ongoing re-registration or re-compliance procedures over the life of a project? Howard, do you want to take that one?
Absolutely. Really good question. So for registration, we register entities, and it's kind of a one-time unless you're deregistered. So once you're registered to be, one of the NERC entities and compliant with our standards, there's not a process that you'd have to be re-registered unless you fall below some sort of a threshold to be deregistered. So it's a one-time process. At what point is it done? Typically it has been the point at which you connect to the system and are generating megawatts. That question has become a little bit more nebulous for inverter-based resources, and we're still working through the timing for registration on that. In some areas, it's date of commercial operation. In some areas, it's that first connection. And so I think we're still trying to figure out how to make that uniform across North America. So we will be working on that and developing a common response for that. What's the process entail? Once we are aware of an entity that meets registration criteria, and we know the region that it's in, that regional entity has registration folks that basically will reach out and contact that particular person or that particular entity and kind of introduce, hey, we're the ERO. This is what NERC is. This is what the particular region is. You have met the criteria for registration, and so we'll go through that process and then kind of explain what it means to be involved in the reliability standards process. So our standards development process is very open and really relies upon active participation from all entities. And so one of the things that we'll be doing, especially in this process, is as we register folks, is to help them understand how that standards development process works and help them become active in the process. So how do you register? How do you submit your comments? How do you vote on the standards? And then how do you make your voice heard there? So we'll be providing some information on that during the registration process too. And then finally, one of the things that we'll be developing as we begin to register and as we begin to make standards changes is we'll have a page that we kind of refer to as a one-stop shop. It'll be similar to all the initiative pages that we talked about earlier. We'll have a page out there that says, hey, now that you've been registered as an entity in this particular arena, and we'll make it specific to inverter-based resources, here's all the standards that currently apply to you, and we'll have those on the page. And here's all the projects that are currently in the process, all the standards that are under development that will be in ballot where your comments and your votes count, to make sure that they have links to that and be able to participate in that. And then if there are future standards that maybe have been approved but aren't actively that aren't being enforced at this point, there'll be that on that page also. So you'll know that, hey, maybe this particular standard isn't applicable now, but in 2026, 2027, whatever the time frame is, you need to be ready to be compliant with this particular standard in the future. So that's a little bit about how the process goes. And again, it kind of that trigger point is when you begin to be producing megawatts and you're impactful to the system. That's the point at which we would be reaching out and making sure that you understand your obligations for reliable operation of the system.
Yeah, sorry.
No, I'm just going to say I'll open it up to other panelists to say if they've got some perspectives on that too.
Yeah, I was going to share from a regional perspective. Once the registration criteria, the proposed registration criteria is finalized, we'll have a significant effort devoted to identifying these entities and then working through outreach and education to help inform them about who we are, and why they should care, and what that means with regard to their obligations to comply with NERC reliability standards. So, I think we are all resourcing for that and planning for a lot of efforts as we move through this project. Does anybody else have anything they wanted to add? It looks like we have a follow-up question. Do solar plus storage systems register together, and is there a reliability benefit for paired resources and registering together?
I could take that one, Sarah, real
Thanks,
quick,
Mark.
and I'll ask my other panelists to fill in whatever gaps I might miss. And they can, they don't have to. It's really the choice of the entity to decide how they want to register. I'd say typically, I think when you look at solar plus storage, it's probably going to be the same LLC or same company that owns that resource, so they probably will register them together. But again, that doesn't mean they have to. And I'll kind of break the reliability benefit question down into two pieces. When you think about solar plus storage, why you do that is kind of the example that Howard gave, you know, where you can extend kind of the availability of that plant more than just daylight hours. And so when they are paired together like that, you have full control over when you are going to charge the battery, when you're going to discharge the battery, based on when that solar plant is available and generating. And so you know, that's it's kind of an all-in-one house kind of construct, where you have the most control when you pair those two resources together. And from a registration standpoint and reliability benefits there, I don't necessarily see there being a strong reliability benefit to actually having them both register together. That's just more of a compliance and kind of paperwork kind of approach. But I do think there's a benefit, reliability benefit for the resources actually, you know, working hand in hand, for sure.
Ted, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I agree with Mark, but I'll just throw the emphasis in there. I think it as far as registering, it is I think more beneficial for them to register together. So my 2 cents.
Well, your 2 cents are worth it. Thank you. I am not seeing any other questions through the chat. I did want to thank everybody for participating today, and especially you know, give a round of applause for our panelists today for imparting their wisdom and knowledge. And I hope that everybody found this worthwhile. I do want to note that the slides will be posted along with the recording of today's webinar. I think starting on NERC's state and regulatory outreach resource page, but the other regions will follow suit. So stay tuned for an announcement about where to find this information. And thank you all for joining us today. I will adjourn the webinar.